Hello, BookTube. It's Wednesday, and here in America, that's New Comic Book Day, when socially suspect 30-year-olds heave themselves out of their parents' rumpus room and waddle to the nearest LCS, local comic shop, where they leave smudgy thumbprints on the pages of new comic books that they have no intention of buying. It's a time-honored ritual to go to the comic shop and buy the latest issues. It was a time-honored ritual for me long before there was such a thing as a comic shop, when you just went to the local dry goods store or the corner store and got your comics there. But the habit for me of going to comic shops and buying new issues has been sporadic in the last 10 years and is all but dead now. Mainly what I go for is graphic novel and omnibus collections of stuff that I already know I like. I don't really, or that intrigues me. I don't really follow weekly comics anymore. If the run looks intriguing enough, then I will buy the graphic novel down the line, but I don't want to pay for the same product twice. So I'm just not interested enough to buy the individual issues and then hang on to them wherever they end up being. So what I tend to do on Wednesdays is check online ahead of time to see what's coming out that day and therefore determine whether or not I need to make a trip. And today, it's the last few weeks have not been good. Today, again, there was nothing that I was going to go and get. There's a big $100 collection of Marvel's The X-Men, the Dark Phoenix saga by Chris Claremont and Dave Cockrum and John Byrne, a massively popular storyline from the 80s in which malevolent cosmic entity possesses one of the X-Men, gives her near infinite power, but also drives her mad. And the team's conflict and the story of what goes into that and all the spin-off stories around it. It's one big, handsome volume, but a friend of mine already gave me it. So there was no reason for me to go to the comic shop for it. And the only other thing that would have qualified today was, we've seen them before, they're called Epic Collections. They're full-color paperback reprint volumes that Marvel Comics does of various runs on various titles of theirs. And they did one today on the Fantastic Four about the coming of Galactus, the gigantic world-devouring villain that they face. And that's of interest to me, but I didn't get it today because next month Marvel is coming out with a big hardcover, a collected volume that has not only that first appearance of Galactus and the Silver Surfer fighting the Fantastic Four, but has subsequent storylines where Galactus fights the Fantastic Four. And I like all of those storylines. And having them in one volume with a beautiful cover is the format that I want. So I didn't bother to get that Epic collection. And I didn't go just to, signal my support, and there aren't any weekly comics that I would want, so I didn't go to my local comic shop this week, and I don't have anything to perorate about to you on the basis of my local comic shop's actual content, because another interesting graphic novel that came out today that I was kind of, sorta, maybe interested in getting is a new volume of reprints of the Teen Titans from 30 years ago, with art by George Perez and then Jose Luis Garcia Lopez, and there's some very interesting storylines, but I was thinking about it and I was thinking, well, okay, but you have those individual issues and you haven't looked at them since you bought them, so they obviously weren't calling to you. So I didn't do that, but that suggested a topic. That suggested that I might talk to you about the Teen Titans, but I've already done that. The Fantastic Four Epic Collection suggested that I might talk to you about that, about Fantastic Four and Galactus, but I'm going to do that next month when the Galactus volume comes out. So it really didn't leave me much to windily theorize about. So I thought instead of talking about specific comics, I would give you an update on a comic book phenomenon, Comicsgate, which I mentioned on this channel months ago. I'll give you a brief reprise for those of you who didn't see that video, lost in my 3,000 videos, and who maybe don't know what it is. It's a grassroots movement that was born and is perpetuated right here on YouTube, of comic book readers protesting the editorial and artistic and writing decisions that Marvel Comics has been making in the last few years, the last 4 years, thereabouts. Protesting forced diversity, protesting forced political correctness, protesting paper-thin plots, protesting the hiring of writers who have no experience in the genre, the hiring of writers who are extremely rude to people on social media, the hiring of writers who don't know about the comic book characters or the backstory that they're writing. It used to be, these protesters point out, it used to be an incredible mark of honor if you were a freelance comic book writer or artist, if you got the nod to work on something like the X-Men or the Avengers. It was you wanted to prove that you were worthy of the greats who'd gone before you, and the gist of Comicsgate, as this phenomenon has come to be called, is that that's no longer true. That Marvel Comics doesn't really care anymore about preserving that kind of legacy, and that a lot of Marvel Comics creators who come on board seem to be operating under the assumption that the characters, the teams, the concepts, the history is theirs, that it's theirs to do with what they want. Not a legacy that they're preserving, but rather a toy that they've been given, and they can use it anyway to make any political or social point that they want. And it has caused a phenomenon, and Comicsgate got its name as sort of an adaptation of Gamergate, in which something roughly similar happened in the world of online video games, where a couple of lone female voices crying out in the wilderness said, these things are incredibly misogynistic. They're encouraging violence towards women. The videos encourage violence towards women. They do it in the world of the video, but it's not hard to see that being porous. It's not hard to see that leaking out into the minds of impressionable 13-year-old boys who are playing video games in which you gain strength and power and points by not only killing women, but brutalizing them. I myself think that was a point that was long overdue to be made about video games. It's just, I lament the fact that it was made usually, in the early years of Gamergate, in such shrill and unappetizing and absolutely abrasive ways. I was at the time totally in agreement with the points that a lot of the women and then some men were making about video games at the beginning of Gamergate. I was in agreement with their points, and I was still outraged by them. And that's bad when you're cheesing off allies. That's bad. And one of the reasons that Gamergate as a name adapted so well to the phenomenon of Comicsgate is because on the surface it looks like a lot of the same dynamics are in play. Most of the popular and most vocal Comicsgate YouTube channels are by men, and most of those men have been fairly outspoken about women. They say, all of them say, there's a fantastic comic book artist who has his own channel now that's growing in popularity. The main architect of Comicsgate is an ex-serviceman who makes he's been all around the world. He has opinions on every subject under the sun, and he tends to make multiple videos per day. What kind of a freak is that? Anyway, these people say, well, no, a lot of my followers are women. No, women don't think that way. No, women agree with the points I'm making, but you get the very strong impression that some of these men wouldn't tolerate, for instance, their wives making more money than them, wouldn't tolerate... In other words, the point I'm trying to make is that there is a definite, no matter what Comicsgaters say, no matter how they try to defend themselves, and certainly if you extend it to the ambit of their followers, their thousands and thousands of followers, there is a very strong whiff of misogyny in Comicsgate. A very strong whiff of not just... The Comicsgaters will say, in response to criticism of the superhero comics throughout the last 70 years, they'll say, well, you say that comics objectify women by making them look unrealistically busty or unrealistically thin-waisted, or make them as less capable but more visually appealing than their male counterparts. And Comicsgaters will sometimes say, well, that's the comics is a male medium, it's escapist fantasy, so of course those things are going to be true. But if that's all you want, if you create a comic book studio of your own, an independently financed comic book studio of your own, and it's pretty clear that your number one editorial dictum at all levels is not, don't be evil or let's make the company shareholders lots of money. If it becomes obvious that your number one company dictum is bigger boobs, then then accusations by your enemies that you are a sexist at the very least are probably not unfounded. So there's been a massive ideological war going on inside the comic book world, mostly connected with Marvel Comics. It hasn't spilled over much to DC, my beloved DC Comics, yet. I dread the day when it does. But mostly connected with Marvel Comics. And the amazing thing to notice in the latest iterations of Comicsgate, as it moves on into whatever it's going to be in a year, is how badly the comic book industry has handled this phenomenon. This is the comic book industry trundled right along. It might have big stories in terms of finance, Marvel going bankrupt a few years ago, that sort of thing. But in terms of an ideological concept, something that's actually fundamental and interesting, that doesn't happen often in the comics world. And something like that has happened now. Comicsgate has happened. It is a legitimate phenomenon for reasons that I'll get to in a minute. There's no way to dismiss it as fringe anymore. And the people who are its targets, and the people who are associated with its targets, Marvel Comics, the editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics, all the artists, all the writers, the ones who have addressed it so poorly. They have done such a bad job that, again, like with Gamergate, they are succeeding in abrasively cheesing off people who might otherwise have allied with them. Of course, if you're a Comicsgater and you have 70,000 followers on YouTube, and you're saying, this person is talentless, and this person is a woman, of course you are. The thing that always bothers me with stuff like this, same thing is true with the President of the United States, is there is directly inciting people to do behavior A, and then there is very consciously creating an atmosphere in which behavior A is easier for anybody to do. Those are two different things, but they're both your fault. You do both of those things, okay? I'm on YouTube, you're on YouTube. It is not a defense in any way to say, when the crap hits the fan, well, I can't control what my fans do. I can't control what my followers do. That is not a defense in any way. You can either directly incite something, or you can create an atmosphere in which that something is much easier for people to do. In both cases, it's your fault. In both cases, you are doing it. You can't absolve yourself either way. And if I, being largely sympathetic to the larger points that Comicsgate has been making, Marvel Comics are, for the most part, irredeemably awful. Just absolutely awful. If I can be sympathetic towards those points and still have my hackles raised every time I watch a Comicsgate video, well then, sure as shooting, if I can pick up on the atmosphere that Comicsgaters are creating, then so can, 10,000 of their followers who just hate women, or who just want to troll somebody, whether they hate anything or not. So I want to say, Comicsgate has made missteps, many missteps, but the targets of Comicsgate, the opponents of Comicsgate, the creators of Marvel Comics have made far, far more missteps, far more things guaranteed to alienate erstwhile allies. Like, for instance, there is a Comicsgate channel called Diversity in Comics. He is the spearhead. He is the leader of this whole thing. Everybody, all Comicsgate said Comicsgate has no leaders, but nevertheless, he is the leader. He makes a video. He makes many videos a day. Again, what kind of a freak makes many videos a day? But he makes a video in the morning using the guy's an endless fount of phrases, of terminology. If this channel has, no pants and me sainted ma, he's got a dozen of those kinds of things. Turns a phrase that he's picked up in one hot corner of the world or other in the course of his... He constantly says two things in his videos. One, that he's old, and 2, that he's in his 40s. So, and those two things don't go together as far as I'm concerned. I'm fairly certain that I don't own any clothing that isn't older than this guy. But one way or another, if he makes a video in the morning and uses one of these weird phrases, elephant in the room, misuse of some $3 word or whatever, without fail, 2 or 3 or 4 smaller Comicsgate channels in the course of that day will make videos using that same word. So this guy has massive, massive influence. And for years, for over a year, he would make videos just trashing the latest garbage Marvel Comics. Because Marvel Comics, the main thing that identifies the problems that he's looking at is that Marvel Comics has been infiltrated not so much by social justice warriors, that's his big bugaboo. Really, Marvel Comics has been infiltrated by YA authors. And it's taken over. I'm fairly certain that this guy doesn't read YA, but the things that he's describing as incensing him in Marvel Comics now are the things that incense everybody, that it gets incensed about YA. The elevation of trivialities, the fact that so many of the main characters, no matter what they come from, no matter what their age is, no matter what crisis they're in, talk like 8-year-olds who've been serially dropped on their heads. The lack of accountability, the lack of serious stakes involved, whether it's, Squirrel Girl who can suddenly just punch Dr. Doom in the face and he's out flat and she's saying, gee, why did all the men before me have so much trouble with this? Whether it's that, or whether it's that the Volgon Empire and the Sumara Empire are coming together across 24 worlds with thousands and thousands of spaceships involved, and a war is imminent that will claim the lives of millions, unless Princess Megan can decide which of those two boys she really likes. Do I like the handsome, comfortable one or the dreamy badass? Whichever of those two things it is suddenly taking storytelling and bringing it down to a level for preschoolers in a genre that doesn't need to be that way. YA doesn't need to be that way, obviously. I sing the praises of YA that is terrifically good, that doesn't talk down to its YA audience. And by the same token, as diversity in comics, and as I would say the same thing, comic books can be incredibly good. They don't have to be silly YA fluff. One way or another. When he makes a video attacking the changes that have been done to Marvel Comics, he's mostly talking about that. There's other stuff too. He can't stand the forced diversity, the shoehorning in of political stuff, and part of that to me seems a bit short-sighted. Part of that to me makes me think that he thinks this is new, and that maybe if he'd made his YouTube channel on Betamax 30 years ago, he'd have been complaining about comic book storylines that are now considered classics. The Defenders, back when this guy was a little kid, did a whole storyline on race riots. on an openly racist group called the Sons of the Serpent, creating race riots, creating racial tension in America. And at the climax of that story, once the good guys have finally won, the leader, his hood is ripped off and he's a black man. Nothing that explosive or that politically preachy nothing even close to that has been done in comics in the last 12 years. So partly when this guy and lots of other Comicsgaters complain about politics being shoved down their throats in comic books, part of that is naive. If these people think that Marvel Comics was leaving Richard Nixon alone when he was in office, they're dead wrong. If these people think that live political issues that writers weren't shoehorning in their political opinions in Marvel Comics long before the creators they're complaining about were born, they're wrong. Part of that is naive. Part of it is also justified. Because you do too much of that. You do that all the time, and you especially do that in a minatory way. You do that in a way that says, not only are these what I believe, but if you don't believe, I don't want your business. Part of that is an outproduct of 2016. If you do that all the time, then you're poisoning your entertainment product, especially if you haven't earned the right to do that. If you are a comic book creator, a 20-something Marvel comic book creator, and all of your plot lines are political, and you've never written a comic book plotline that isn't, and that was really, really good, if you've never, in other words, earned any creative capital with your fans, then you have no right to try it. And if you try it anyway, you can be rightfully suspected of simply using the comic book where you work as a bully pulpit for other things, for things that, that you're not getting enough traction on your blog. But if you do this in the Avengers, you'll get plenty of people. And the key is that it isn't working. Marvel Comics sales are tanking. There's no interest. There's a big reason for that, which is that for a long time, Marvel Comics were unrecognizable to people who saw them from the movies, and unrecognizable to longtime fans. I've mentioned this on this channel before, that a year ago, or 2 years ago, if you looked at Marvel's lineup, the Hulk wasn't the Hulk, Thor wasn't Thor, Iron Man wasn't Iron Man, the Avengers weren't the Avengers, Captain America wasn't Captain America. It was absolutely ridiculous. You had all these characters you've never heard of before suddenly being made to be the main marquee attractions, even though they weren't as interesting, didn't have the history, didn't have the fan base. That was one part of it, those complaints. And through those complaints, the whole time that this guy, let's center on diversity in comics for now, the whole time that he was doing this, he was also conducting brush fires on social media with these people. They're apparently as toxic on social media. I mean, I wouldn't take anybody's word for it, but this guy and a bunch of other Comicsgate fan channels have shown screen caps of tweets from comic book creators. So I'm not taking anybody's word for it. I'm reading what these people wrote. And in addition to, in the midst of all of that brush fire back and forth with these creators, who were naturally offended, they were naturally put back on their pins and needles. They naturally, even some of the weaker of them, felt threatened. And my larger point, connected to my point earlier, is that if you have 70,000 followers, you don't know for sure that these people haven't been threatened. You know for sure that you've created an atmosphere in which they can be mocked personally, belittled personally, medically, physically, visually, not just creatively. You know you've created that environment. You know you've made it acceptable to do that. So I don't think that it's entirely impossible that some of these people have been threatened by followers, by subscribers to Diversity in Comics and other Comicsgate channels. And, while I'm on the subject, before I go on to my larger point, the standard knee-jerk reaction that channels like that have when they are told, either by the person directly or indirectly, that someone has been threatened, their standard knee-jerk reaction does them no credit at all, and they really ought to abandon it. The standard knee-jerk reaction from Comicsgate channels that are told that is, give me proof. Show me screen caps. Make your case. Prove to me that you've been threatened. They don't like not being taken at their word, and yet, what I understand, the SJW crowd often does lie about such things, but nevertheless, the burden is not on the threatened person if you've got a mob at your back. But one way or another, in the midst of this brush firing, in addition to all the sniping back and forth, these professionals at Marvel also sniped, never directly to this guy. They hardly ever talk directly to this guy. It's crazy. Every mistake that they have made is a force error. They could have handled this completely differently right from the beginning. If Comicsgate had erupted for somehow, some way, when Roy Thomas was in charge of Marvel Comics, this would have been handled so easily that all parties involved would have been laughing about it in the letters page of Marvel Comics within a month. Instead, it's been 2 torturous years of Marvel creators doing everything wrong. And one of the things they did wrong was they said, okay, well, you're a failed comic book artist. You couldn't hack it at Marvel. That's why you're being such a carper from the cheap seats. Why don't you put your money where your mouth is and create a comic book? Get it in bookstores, and then we'll see who sells better. We'll see if you can make a dent in the independent market at all. Okay, a fairly legitimate point. I don't think it's as legitimate as the people who made it think that it is, because it doesn't say anything to the actual substance of Diversity in Comics complaints. I could make those complaints. I have no interest in making a comic book. A lot of my complaints would be the same as his. They don't become valid only once I've sold a few copies of Erasmus in Action or whatever. But one way or another, he took them at their word. He started promoting on his channel an independent comic book that he was creating. He was going to farm out the various duties. He was going to make a professional project And then when he had enough backers on GoFundMe or IndieGoGo or one of those types of self-funding campaigns, then he would shop it around and get a publisher. And once he had a publisher, he would be in the distribution menus and he would be in bookstores. And then there you would see it. There you go. Once he's in bookstores, then we would see, will it succeed or will it fail? And when he got all the way to the threshold of doing that, got to the threshold, got a publisher, all of a sudden there was massive backlash. All of a sudden the same people that he'd been criticizing for 2 years didn't want to risk that his book might sell in comic book stores. And things went on behind the scenes. The version that's accepted in Comicsgate is that a massively successful comic book writer, Mark Waid, called up the publisher, this little publisher that Diversity in Comics had sold his comic to. They called up that publisher and put pressure. Mark Waid put pressure on that publisher not to take it, to cancel the contract. And eventually, according to Diversity in Comics, the publisher of that small house called him and begged to be let out of their agreement. I said, I've never experienced bullying like this in my entire career. I don't want anything to do with this. No, please, please, please. And Diversity in Comics let him go and didn't threaten legal action or anything like that. And so the comic was not going to be published by this little publisher. That's the Comicsgate version. There's another version that is you can piece together just as well, which is that Mark Waid says that he didn't threaten anybody. Mark Waid says that he called the guy merely to talk. The publishing company put out an official statement saying, we were not threatened, we were not leaned on in any way. And the publisher, in tears on the phone to Diversity in Comics, could easily have been crying because he didn't want the mob that I just talked about to attack his business, which that mob will do if Diversity in Comics so much as hints that he wants it done. This publisher had to know that. 10 minutes Googling around will tell you that. So there's a narrative, there's an alternate narrative to the one that Comicsgate is saying. Comicsgate says Mark Waid threatened the publisher, canceled the deal, shows these people don't play fair ball. The other narrative is that Mark Waid called the publisher just to say, did you Google this guy? The publisher Googled the guy and backed out on his own, thinking the comic book looks good. Diversity in Comics seems honorable, but now that I've looked him up, I don't want to be connected to the rest of this because it could easily backfire on me. Either one of those narratives might work, but they both come to the same thing, which is that thanks to Marvel's behavior, it is possible for Marvel's enemies to say that Marvel killed competition because they didn't like the politics of the people involved. And you know, the thing that mystifies me about that, in addition to how ham-handed it is, there isn't, like I said, if Roy Thomas had been in charge of Marvel Comics, nothing like that would have happened whatsoever. Roy Thomas would have had the same instantaneous idea of how to fix things that I would think Disney, which owns Marvel Comics, would also have had. I know that this phenomenon has been brought to Disney's attention. I know that for a fact. Diversity in Comics constantly says in his videos, several videos a day. I ask you, what kind of a freak makes several videos a day? But he has said several times that he has industry insiders. I right now have only one insider at Marvel Comics, but I have more than one insider at Disney, and I can say beyond a shadow of a doubt there have been many meetings about this phenomenon, about the heat of this phenomenon. And most of those meetings have been generated by the fact that this IndieGoGo campaign for Diversity in Comics' comic book didn't raise $30,000. It raised an enormous amount of money, $250,000. And the comic book artist, the really good comic book artist that I mentioned, started an IndieGoGo campaign of his own. It's going to be at $1 million by the end of the year. That's massive amounts of money for today's anemic comic industry. And DC, corporate DC, knows that. They've had it all laid out for them. and one of the people that helped to lay it out is a friend of mine. I know for sure that it was all done accurately. Weren't any philosophical axes in that boardroom. And it mystifies me why Disney Comics has not done the same thing that it would have taken Roy Thomas 10 minutes to figure out how to do. Of course, the answer here is not to fight and to block people on Twitter, but rather to co-opt. All you have to do is watch 5 Diversity in Comics videos. Pick 5 at random. Pick 5 other random Comicsgate videos. from any channel, anywhere in the last 2 years. All you have to do is watch 5 at random to see that these people are making a ton of good points, that they represent a very large constituent in the very small comic book buying community. So co-opt them. It is such simple sense. If you've got this guy and he has a huge following and he's making lots of editorial sense in his criticism of your comics, offer him an editorial job. Boom! Then all of his followers are your followers too, and you can start to address problems the right way. Inside the tent instead of outside the tent. I don't understand why no one at Marvel Comics has had the sense to do that. And I don't understand, even if they haven't had the sense to do it, I don't understand why their Disney overlords have simply not told them to do it. The way they're doing it now, you tell the guy, you taunt him for a year, you got to make a comic book and get it in bookstores and see if it can compete with us, and then when it comes close to doing that, put the kibosh on it, at least allow a narrative that says that that's what happened. That is the total wrong way to do things. Totally wrong. To say nothing of the other points that this channel, Diversity in Comics, has made. He has pointed, and so have others. There are other Comicsgate channels that dig down into the numbers, into the strata of what's actually going on in the business, and point out that Marvel Comics sell abysmally, and that some of the ones that sell the worst, Marvel defiantly, perversely will take that creative team that has already proven they can't sell a book and move it, mutatis mutandis, just without changing anything, to a different book. or they'll hire somebody who has no experience in the comics field whatsoever, a YA author or something like that, on a high-profile book. That book will flop. It'll do a horrible job. Fans won't buy it, in other words. And not only will they keep that book going, but the next time they can, they'll hire somebody else from outside who knows nothing about comics to headline another marquee property, when they already know that that approach doesn't work. Marvel's reactions to Comicsgate, straight up the line, have been absolutely wrong in every way. That mystifies me. That is, to me, I'll wrap this up for now because this is going on too long, but the main lesson from the current stage of Comicsgate is that Comicsgate is at a turning point. First of all, in my opinion, although a lot of what they do grates on me, I think they've proven their points better than their opposition. I think that they have the moral high ground. They've made a case that comics are bad. They've listed the ways in which Marvel Comics are bad, and they've said, if these ways continue, these comics will stink, and if they continue to stink, fans won't buy them. Sales will go down, will continue to go down, and all of that has proved true. There's that. That's one part of the turning point. The other part of the turning point is this IndieGoGo business, because Diversity in Comics and Ethan Van Sciver are not the only two people doing this. It's now become widespread, and the money is there. And you can find a whole bunch of people, Trump supporters, who will cheer you and thumb you up and like your videos and subscribe out of hatred, but it's a very different thing when they're paying money. The money is there. There's money there, and to me, that says this is a lot more than just Trump supporters. To me, that says that these people have inadvertently or intentionally tapped into a legitimately large part of comic book fandom that just doesn't like what they're seeing and is willing to put their money into something that might prove a viable alternative. And that's where Comicsgate is right now. A lot of them are pursuing IndieGoGos. So the critique channels, the critiques of individual comics and writers at Marvel are continuing, but it seems to me that some fire has gone out of them. It's not as imperative that you do that if you are proving that there is a financially viable alternative that you can just pursue on your own. Why bother criticizing Squirrel Girl if you can make a comic of your own that makes a heap of money? You won't have the same flame for it. There are plenty of Comicsgate fans channels that still bash individual issues. Diversity in Comics still bashes individual issues. But that's the split. That's the fork in the road that Comicsgate is at right now. On the one hand, it's opening up a viable, entirely different comic book ecosystem that it's creating as it goes along, which is fascinating. Historians of comic books 20, 50 years from now are going to look back and find that fascinating, that phenomenon. Because I think that's the future. But on the other hand, the flame wars seem to have died down a bit. The Comicsgate is still percolating along, but the creators of the various channels are largely repeating themselves. They're saying, this comic was bad a year ago, it's still bad. This creator was bad a year ago for these 3 reasons. The 3 reasons still apply. The message has been made, repeated, and it's gone home. The creators know it. The Disney corporate overlords know it. And it seems to be in a holding pattern. So I think Comicsgate is sort of waiting for the next thing to happen. And I think it will be connected with this business of just funding your own content, which is fascinating in its own right. Somebody ought to write a book about it. I hope that somebody out there, I would prefer it if it is a Comicsgater, I hope that somebody is writing this book, because the numbers behind the IndieGoGo campaigns show that a book on this subject would sell like crazy. In fact, although I don't imagine that he has a whole lot of free time, Diversity in Comics, the guy behind that channel, really ought to think about a book. Because a whole bunch of them could write a book, but if he did it, books have a life. They live, they sell, they last a long time. It would be a good idea. I think if they were smart, now that the initial inflammation over what they're doing has died down, and now that their points have gotten across, I think now would be the time, maybe for a couple of them to band together and write a book. But one way or another. That's all I've got for you in terms of comics. It's still a hideously long video, but it's not about any one creative thing. Instead, it's about one of the most fascinating phenomenon to happen in the comic book world in the last 30 years, Comicsgate. And that's where it is. I don't foresee myself doing another Comicsgate update until that next shoe drops, whatever it is. Some new bombshell. I don't have any idea what it would be. But in the meantime, we're going to try and talk about an individual comic of some kind next week. We shall see. So I will mark this video clearly so that you know not to waste 40 minutes on something if you're not interested. But I'll wrap this up for now, and we'll get back to books next time. Thank you, BookTube.